Greetings, friends of liberty. 'Twas about 3 weeks ago that, relaxing in the chair of my study, and finally beginning the 5th volume of Gibbon's Decline and Fall, my attention was most rudely interrupted by the noise of chunks of soot falling from the chimney onto the blazing coals of the fire, and then tumbling out onto the marble of the hearth. As engrossed as I was, I rose, briefly kicking the chunks back into the hearth, and then resumed my Gibbon. However, later that night, having retired, I thought to my last experience of having our chimneys swept. 3 months ago, the master sweep had employed a young 6-year-old apprentice, as is of course common, to climb and scrape the soot from the flue of the living-room chimney. The flue being on average only 9 by 14 inches. The poor boy had become stuck, his legs in the tight confines, having been brought up to his chin in climbing. Fortunately, after 20 minutes, he managed to extricate himself, but only in part, because the skin on his knees and legs began to bleed profusely, they becoming so slippery with his blood that he could slide them down to below his waist again and make his escape back to our hearth. And what a sight he was! Blood dripping everywhere, from his forehead, elbows, and feet, as well as his knees and legs. The master sweep, however, nonplussed at the sight, apparently having seen it many times before, then sent an even younger, smaller, thinner apprentice, a boy of 5, who happened to be the brother of the 6-year-old, up the flue, and he managed it without becoming stuck himself. He too, however, as is common, ascended the flue in his birthday clothes, thus also emerging blackened and scraped. And so, remembering all this, and desiring to avoid it, I had an idea. Straight away the next morning I told Reeves of my plan, and together we went down to the workshop of the stable, and after a period of hours assembled a device for cleaning the chimney. This consisted of flexible cane rods, which, having metal inserts, could be screwed together, end on end, so that the resulting length could reach to the top of any chimney. And at the top of the rods we fixed, in effect, an umbrella of brushes, which could be opened by a wire which ran along the rods down to the last bottom segment. This umbrella of brushes, when opened and pulled down the flue, during each passage, should scrape a substantial portion of the soot and accumulated creosote away, it falling onto the hearth. And after a few passes, the chimney should be much cleaner. And so, we first tried my device, finding that it worked remarkably well in accumulating a huge pile of soot in the hearth of the living-room fireplace. However, the house, having yet another 16 chimneys, and I having no desire to soil our clothes further, I immediately sent message to the master sweep, who lived not half a mile away. He arrived within the hour with his usual band of apprentices. I soon showed him the device and asked him to try it out, and he did it with remarkable success, by telling him that I would pay him the same rate per chimney, but would require that he use my device. And this he did, carting off huge loads of soot, which had fallen into the hearths of the 16 fireplaces, thus making everyone, not least the little boys, if not happy, then at least relieved. Now if we turn from the maintenance and care of housing and homes in my own 18th century to that of housing, buildings, and even the regulation of land in your own 20th and 21st century in the United States of America, we find today under review the book Housing America, Building Out of a Crisis. In this, some of the most knowledgeable specialists in real estate, land use, and housing today, from William Tucker to Bernard Segan to Lawrence White to Robert Nelson, each devote a chapter of the 15 included to the subject of their expertise. Let's examine in brief some of the more notable to see what we might discover and learn about America's housing problems and how to fix them, if only the country would listen. Chapter 1, Is There a Housing Crisis? Here, authors Holcombe and Powell set the stage by pointing out the nature of the modern American housing market. Most housing in the United States is allocated in the private market, but that market is heavily regulated and government policies dictate whether people can build new housing on their land, what type of housing they're allowed to build, the terms allowed in rental contracts, and much more. A small percentage of housing is also directly provided by government public housing projects. Within that context of governmental control, there is usually not a crisis per se, but the many aspects of governmental interference and regulation make the housing market much less efficient and more costly than need be. Another consequence is the number of the homeless driven into the streets by policies that have vastly reduced the number of cheap housing or rental units. A third issue is the lack of new housing. And a fourth, the tyrannical hand of zoning law intruding everywhere. Having seen Chapter 1's overview, let's turn to Chapter 2, where we find Samuel Staley showing how the so-called smart growth movement in America by urban planners and city officials has actually resulted in quite dumb, expensive growth. Smart growth all started in 1926 when the U.S. Supreme Court, in the case Euclid v. Ambler Realty, first allowed municipalities to zone areas for industrial, commercial, or residential use. Previously, individual property owners had been able to customize their preferences and control growth in their neighborhoods by using easements and covenants. But now, community and town planners overrode their choices. And all this resulted in housing becoming slowly but inevitably more expensive. For example, in California, which is among the most restrictive, during the 1970s, California's housing values rose 267% compared to 176% increase for the entire nation. And so, a home on a quarter-acre lot in Chicago is likely to sell for about $140,000 more than its construction costs. In San Diego, for $285,000 more. In New York City, $350,000 more, and in San Francisco, $700,000 more. In response to the increased housing prices, communities over the next decades then mandated that developers of new housing construct a certain number of subsidized low-income units, this being called inclusionary zoning. But this in turn jacked up the price of the remaining units, which were only affordable now to the upper middle class. And so, where inclusionary zoning has been adopted, as for example in the Bay Area, housing production actually fell by 31% because of the lack of profit for developers. In addition, complying with numerous additional regulations and attending planning sessions was time-consuming and costly for developers, giving them even less incentive to participate in the process. In summary, contemporary urban planning effectively collectivizes the land market by making decisions about use subject to legislative control and, in most circumstances, majority rule. In the brilliant Chapter 3, written by Bernard Segan, who was one of the most contested judicial nominees of the Reagan era, Segan shows us how productive not implementing zoning is. How does he show this? By focusing on the one city in all of America, or perhaps the whole Anglosphere, or even maybe in all of Western civilization itself, that has the least zoning, Houston, Texas. Thankfully, the inhabitants of Houston have rejected zoning over and over again in 1948, 1962, and 1993. And what has been the result? Safe building codes are nonetheless used and adhered to without government mandates because fire insurance companies and the banks investing in new developments aren't going to lend developers any money unless their assured buildings are built to safe standards. B, because existing residents and homeowners in Houston can't restrict the construction of new housing, housing and rental prices are much lower, with one study finding an increase of only 61% from 1973 to 1980, while new home prices in Dallas increased 225%. Just before the Great Recession, equivalent homes in Houston were less than 20% the price of homes in San Jose, California. Fast forward to 2025, equivalent homes in San Diego and San Francisco cost at least twice as much as homes in Houston. And all this despite the fact that Houston is booming economically. C, with no zoning, it's easy to have an auto shop or grocery store located right in a residential neighborhood, which is more convenient for many residents. This would be called mixed-use zoning, which is usually not allowed. Finally, D, zoning benefits the rich because they have the money and the time to go to the public meetings and hire whatever consultants they need to game the process in their favor. This can result in exclusionary, segregated communities. But Houston, not surprisingly, has little segregation of its neighborhoods. Having seen Houston's real estate and housing superiority over most cities in all of Western civilization, let's turn now to Chapter 4 and author William Tucker, whose book, The Excluded Americans, which focused on American homelessness, I reviewed here. In that book, Tucker began by talking about sleeping for one night in New York's Grand Central Station. And here again, he begins by talking about sleeping in a flop house, a cheap hotel for poor people or migrants, as a young man while vacationing. Unfortunately, such cheap lodging has all but disappeared from downtown areas where the poor and marginal inevitably congregate. The reason is simple: building code enforcement. Inevitably, some politician has come along with a campaign to clean up downtown and get rid of substandard housing. Code enforcement is always the tool of choice, but better housing does not appear magically in its place. One way that building codes are particularly destructive is the requirement when people or companies renovate older housing that they bring it up to the new code. This, while usually unneeded for safety reasons, often proves impossible or expensive, leading to higher rents or even abandonment of the units. The hatred of flophouses and cheap single-room occupancy hotel lodgings was exhibited long ago in America by that progressive reformer Jacob Riis, who in his famous book, How the Other Half Lives, demonized tenement housing. What Tucker shows us throughout this chapter is that housing codes are the equivalent of minimum wage laws. Minimum wage laws create unemployment among low-skilled workers, and similarly, housing codes and the destruction of cheap hotel lodgings create homelessness among the poor. Two sides of the same coin. Turning to Chapter 5, Randall O'Toole treats us to a more in-depth examination of the paradoxically named smart growth policy. He points out that, A, contrary to what smart growth advocates say, most Americans, 82%, preferred a single-family home in the suburbs, while only 18% wanted a home in the city close to work, public transportation, and shopping, which is what smart growth advocates want to force on all of us. B, most municipalities in the U.S. are composed 90+% of commuters. The only cities that aren't are either university towns with large percentages of young people or major cities with large concentrations of downtown jobs, such as New York, San Francisco, and Boston. The reality is that most people don't want to live close to work. C, he points out that Los Angeles is actually an example of true smart growth, having A, the highest population density of any U.S. urban area, B, the fewest miles of freeway per capita of any major U.S. urban area, and C, an excellent jobs housing balance with jobs distributed among more than 100 different major employment centers. Of course, there's lots of smog because people are stuck in so much stop-and-go traffic. If smart growth worked, none of these problems, like congestion and pollution, would exist. Given that California was among the first in the nation to adopt smart growth, it's not surprising that, as of 2025, 3 of the top 5 most expensive housing markets are located in California. Similarly, from 1975 to 2005, home prices tripled in Houston, but in California regions, such as Los Angeles, grew by 12 times. Let's skip Chapter 6, which deals with so-called inclusionary zoning, already mentioned. And also Chapter 7 on rent control, which has generally, since the 1990s, been on the decline except for New York City. Although, since 2019, there has been a resurgence in some blue states. Chapter 8 deals with federal housing assistance. In the past, the majority of federal housing assistance occurred through the construction of public housing, while today most federal housing aid occurs through rental assistance programs such as vouchers. This switch, initiated during the Reagan administration, has proved remarkably productive, since public housing projects are often prone to becoming dilapidated, dangerous, and dirty. And that's not surprising, since no one owns them, so no one cares what happens to or can control what happens in them. In contrast, giving people vouchers allows them to purchase private units. Incidentally, housing for the poor on the free market is produced by what's called filtering. First, people build houses for the rich, then over time these deteriorate to a degree or go out of style, and after a while they're renovated into multifamily dwellings, apartments, or, as used to be the case, single-room occupancy hotels for the poor. An example of filtering is the area of Cleveland formerly known as Millionaires Row, because it was the home to many wealthy millionaires such as John D. Rockefeller. This area is now almost exclusively low-income housing. Next comes Chapter 9 on eminent domain. Eminent domain, the acquisition of private property for public use, used to be fairly respectable in the U.S. Respectable, that is, until the 2005 Supreme Court decision of Kelo v. New London. That changed everything. This 5-4 decision allowed the municipal government of New London to simply expropriate Miss Kelo's property in the attempt to create a small urban village, which was never made anyway. Many in the country expressed shock and dismay at this naked theft of an individual's home for alleged public gain. The Kelo decision subsequently gave judicial warrant in numerous instances for cities seizing people's homes and businesses, the municipal officials often lying on their application forms by declaring that perfectly good properties were blighted and thus eligible to be condemned for seizure. Chapters 11, 12, and 13 by Mark Thornton, Lawrence White, and Stan Leibowitz give us 90 pages of free market analysis on America's Great Recession and the governmentally created housing bubble. Let's review some of the lowlights. A. Alan Greenspan, as head of the Fed, was mainly responsible for goosing the market by putting interest rates down to 1%, lower than they'd been in the previous 40 years. B. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were a big part of the problem. These were too-big-to-fail government-sponsored enterprises, which specifically bought normal and substandard mortgages from banks, which, by guaranteeing the repayment of these mortgages, indirectly facilitated credit-unworthy homeowners to get mortgages from the aforementioned banks. But these were mortgages they could never repay, which made the bubble even more bubblicious. C. In addition, variable rate mortgages made many borrowers vulnerable to a rise in interest rates, which is precisely what occurred from 2004 to 2006, rising from 1% to 5% in those 2 years and deflating the bubble in the process. D. One of the many ways that the exaggerated governmental emphasis on helping everyone and his dog get a mortgage was affected was by the Federal Housing Administration interpreting lower rates of minority mortgage acceptance as being due to racism. A famous study conducted by the Boston Federal Reserve in 1992 claimed to have discovered such lender bias. But when the author of Chapter 12, Stan Leibowitz, reviewed the study a year later, publishing the results in the Wall Street Journal, he and his co-author found numerous errors, which, when removed, eliminated all lender bias. Nonetheless, through the next 15 years, leading up to the Great Recession, reports like these were constantly used to justify giving minorities mortgages irrespective of their credit worthiness. Countrywide Financial was one of the biggest practitioners of loosening mortgage standards for minorities, and not surprisingly, one of the first to enter insolvency in January of 2008. Finally, we come to our last two chapters, 14 and 15, these focusing on proprietary communities. What are these? Florida's Walt Disney World is one, and there are many others like homeowners and residential associations, cooperatives, and condominiums. These have skyrocketed in popularity in the U.S. over the last half century, now accounting for about 50% of all new construction. They have a typical size of 200 to 300 units, with voting rights granted by how many units you own. Unlike a coercive governmental community, these can offer hundreds of options and variations in subsidizing the provision and maintenance of streets, snow and garbage removal, lighting, recreational facilities, and security services, allowing participants a democratic voice in choosing policies. They can thankfully forbid, for example, mostly peaceful protests, which might trash a community, and can legally discriminate against subpopulations like children who might disturb senior citizens. At the same time, they might control the color you paint your home, where you plant a bush, whether you can build a fence, and how frequently you mow your lawn, which many don't appreciate. Chapter 15 concludes by describing how regular towns and cities could, as long as enough citizens consented, turn their own neighborhoods into proprietary communities. In conclusion, I found this book to be magnificent. The numerous experts found here, some whose books I've already read and reviewed, addressing from a free market point of view many of the most important problems besetting American housing and real estate, while offering practical solutions towards fixing them. I would give it an A. Happy for my part that my England is slowly starting to become aware of and address the problem of poor young boys being exploited, abused, and even killed at times by adult chimney sweeps. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.